Hello.
Hey, Craig. How are you?
Pretty good, thank you.
That's awesome.
I'm quite excited. We've got a special guest today.
I'm very excited.
Jaylene, welcome to the podcast. A round of applause, I guess. All the crew, round of applause. Welcome to the Safetrac podcast. Very nice to have you.
Well, Jaylene is a relatively new Safetrac employee.
Yes.
She's our new legal and compliance officer, which we're totally excited because prior to now we've always outsourced the role. To insource it is a very exciting movement for Safetrac, and it's a huge thing for me because it's an enormous amount of work removed, and so I'm so glad to have you here, Jaylene.
Oh, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Well, you've been a wonderful addition, and it's great to have somebody who really is as passionate about the compliance space as I am, because it's a rare thing to be passionate about compliance, right? Most people,
Told.
oh my God, why
I
do you
thought it
want to
was
do that?
everyone's perspective of compliance, but apparently it's not.
Increasing with passion the further we get through
Okay.
Safetrac.
By the end of this podcast, you'll love it as much as we do.
Yeah, it's interesting. What makes you passionate about compliance?
What does make me passionate? That's a good question. I've always had an interest for politics. I've always had an interest for law, and I've always had an interest for education. And I think somehow I found myself in compliance and educating people on the regulations. And I think bringing all of those together, I found a space where I was thriving. And then I would bring it into every area of my life and no one wanted to hear about it. So then I realised I need to work in this space. Like I need to actually just do it for work and not take it home because I'm told to stop talking about it. But I think legal education is really important because, I mean, there's so much to unpack. Right?
Well,
and there's
there
so
is.
much risk for getting it wrong, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So, yeah, no, I agree with you.
And at the end of the day, compliance is there to keep people safe,
Absolutely.
whether that be through psychosocial or through literal health and safety issues, or keep things fair. So I guess that comes from a compassionate standpoint as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned that employment law is your area of particular passion.
It is, yes. So I worked in compliance management for about 10 years whilst juggling two small children because I thought, why not just do it all at the same time? Renovate a house at the same time too, just because, you know, who needs to sleep?
That's a living.
And so then, yeah, when I moved into private practice, I working in employment law. It's very near and dear to me. It's very much in line with what I was doing in compliance management from an education perspective. But I guess what concerned me the most is that by the time a client would come into the office, more often than not, it was already too late. So being here in this space in legal education, which is essentially what it is that we can shift into a more proactive space to help organisations set up all the systems that they need to hopefully not find themselves going into a law office when it's already too late.
Yeah, it's a funny thing, you know, Safetrac's been around for 26 years, and the thing we love to say, because it's true, is in 26 years we have not had a client who's been found to have an inadequate training program in place. That's a pretty great record. The clients who are taking on our program are actually really proactive and are all trying to do the right thing too.
Yes.
So
Why they've sourced training.
Correct, that's right. So the two seem to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we've just come off from doing our latest webinar,
We have.
which I thought was quite good.
No, I think it was actually the best webinar we've done. I mean, I don't like to brag that much, but normally I'm doing them on my own and I feel a bit lonely out there by myself. And this time you were there and it was so good.
And we unpacked what compliance changes happened over the past financial year. So we're coming to the end, FY25, and we were looking ahead at what changes are coming in FY26. And I thought we could do the same in the podcast and how hard it is to keep on top of things.
Well, it is. I mean, we've now got over 60 regulators in Australia alone. It's incredible.
Yeah.
I think we've now got over 400 sets of laws that companies need to be compliant with. Ignorance is not an excuse. So not understanding the law and how it applies to your business, it's not an excuse for non-compliance. The ability for organisations to stay up to speed with all of those laws is becoming really, really complex and very, very costly.
Yeah.
The cost of doing business, I think, is really, really increasing as a result of all these compliance measures. And the thing is, I think now there's so many regulators, you know, as a business owner myself, you know, I get to help organisations know what the laws are and so forth, but actually applying them to my own business. I mean, we're 75 staff now, so we're no longer a very small organisation, but we fit in this really interesting space of every single regulator seems to have a different interpretation of what a small business is, and different obligations apply to small, medium and large businesses depending upon the size. And the size can depend upon the number of people you have, your turnover, your revenue, or, a different matrix of factors, sometimes both. So actually just figuring out which bit of the law applies to your size business is complex in itself.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess just to add to that, sometimes need to go back and look at the legislation and the regulations and ask, why is this in place? And usually it's either due to a health and safety measure, or it's due to poor quality of service, or, the list is endless. So, for example, we're seeing so many changes in the WHS space. We're seeing the industrial manslaughter offences that have now come into place because people are going to work and they're not returning home. We're still seeing the risks playing out in practice. So then we have to constantly amend and modify our laws and regulations just to make sure everyone gets to go home safely.
It's a really interesting point you make because it's the heart of all compliance. Everybody acts ethically, honestly, reasonably and safely. You're probably compliant with most laws at its fundamental framework.
Well, if they need laws, if it was so innate within us, we wouldn't.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you look at something like modern slavery. Why do we need modern slavery laws? Because organised aren't acting ethically, they're not acting honestly, and they're treating people appallingly. So therefore, other organisations need to be called upon to try to stamp that out and to stop that from happening.
If we're looking at large organisations versus small organisations, smaller organisations can find themselves disproportionately disadvantaged from having to comply with the same regulations that larger organisations have to comply with.
Absolutely.
They might not have internal HR, they might not have internal compliance, and so they've got this raft of legislation and regulations in front of them thinking, well, how do I keep up with this? And they might not even be the cause, perhaps, of some of the issues that we're seeing in practice in terms of modern slavery and whatnot. That's generally in our largest supply chains.
Well, it's interesting. You make 2 points that I want to raise, which is in relation to modern slavery is an interesting one because our size organisation isn't required to file.
No.
Most of our clients are. So therefore, part of them and their compliance with the modern slavery laws is that they ensure that their supply lines are compliant with the modern slavery laws. So really, in order to make their job easy and for us to be a good vendor, we need to be compliant with the laws anyway. So even though you're not required under the law to, if you actually want to deliver services to these companies, then you need to be pretty compliant with those laws anyway. The other thing that I think is really interesting is the laws that came in under the Respect at Work and how there was a framework that they've obviously developed, but there's a proportionality of things that they expect organisations to do based upon their size. And I really like that implementation. So they've sort of said the law applies to everyone, but how much of and what we expect large organisations to do is have a whole complex framework. We're looking at a whole lot of things across your organisation. You're expected to survey, benchmark, you're expected to have your leaders be proactive in stamping this out, etc. There's all these things you should be doing. And all organisations should do that to some measure, but how much they do is proportionate to the size of the organisation. And I think that's really sensible.
Absolutely.
I'd love to see that approach adopted by more regulators.
Well, perhaps not everywhere, but where it's relevant, depending on the organisation, the industry, the risk.
Yep,
so where the risk is high, it makes sense that it needs to be consistent across all organisations and all industries.
Looking back to what we've just been discussing happened in FY25, one of the biggest things that people have been worrying about is, according to our poll, our data, thanks to everyone for answering, is the psychosocial regulation, everything that's happening around that. So, and there's been changes this year, as far as I understand.
Changes last year.
Yes, the end of last year.
What are those changes and what can people be doing to make sure they're up to date, and what are the best practices to stay compliant?
Well, there's been I guess we've always had, under the workplace health and safety laws, we always had a framework that said that mental health was part of that framework. Yep. But now we've specifically acknowledged psychosocial health as a separate part of workplace health and safety. So the acknowledgement of that and the requirement to look after psychosocial health is now a positive requirement that an organisation needs to do. So what that means, psychosocial health as itself is a really large area in terms of it is about the impact that the workplace might have on somebody's individual mental health. So it might be if people become psychologically injured because of stress loads, unreasonable work demands, bullying, sexual harassment, these sort of unsafe work practices and the impact they have on somebody's mental health.
Jaylene, you brought up a really good example.
I did talk about it in the webinar. Yeah. So excessive or unrealistic workloads is, a hot topic because I think we're moving towards, I guess, a time where we're not just leaving work at work and we're more often than not we're taking work home or we're not switching off from work, accessible through our iPads, through our iPhones or whichever phone you've got. And so we're all connected, right? And it's very difficult to disconnect. So coming back to the case, there's a recent case at a mine site in New South Wales, which I thought was particularly interesting. There were 2 accountants that suffered psychological injury due to excessive workloads. And the main reason is because they had lack of support, unclear job roles, but also because their supervisors were actually based in Switzerland. And so then all of a sudden we're looking at time differences. There wasn't this period of time, just on my recollection of the case, where they could merely just switch off from work because of the time zones. There was this constant focus on the job. Reporting deadlines were completely unrealistic in looking at this time frame issue. Also, the inadequate rest opportunities. So when you'd expect to be switching off in Australia and resting and spending time with the family is perhaps when they were actually expected to do the work. So the outcome of that is that there were enforceable undertakings somewhere around the ballpark of $1 million, and then a number of measures the workplace had to put in place to mitigate psychosocial risks. So the ramifications are quite severe. I just wanted to mention here too that there are regulations rolling out across the states. I believe Victoria's the last one to roll out their regulations by the end of this year. So that should provide more guidance to businesses as to how to manage this space. Yep. There's a lot of resources out there, but training is so important.
Yep. Yeah.
First, I have to understand what it is to then know how to mitigate the risk.
So best practices with psychosocial that we were speaking about in the webinar, obviously ongoing training.
Well, first, I would say, is that you have to identify the hazard. So you have to find out what the hazard is. Yep. And that really involves consulting with your staff, because your staff would be the ones to give you insight as to what's happening in practice. Staff must feel that they can approach their managers and there's not going to be fear of retaliation from approaching their manager, which is what I saw in employment law. So there were a number of employees who felt that they couldn't even go to their employer and say, I have this struggle, or I have carers' responsibilities, I need flexible work. I mean, we're kind of blurring into other spaces, but it's connected.
Yeah.
The excessive workload is bleeding into home time. So there wasn't even an opportunity for employees to feel that they could talk to their managers. So there's a clear breakdown in communication. But you can only identify the hazard if you have that open communication with your staff. Let's assume you know what all the hazards are. You then have to assess all the risks. You have to look at the nature of the work, the likelihood of it happening again, the seriousness, again, through consultation. Put some control risks in place. And this is sometimes a matter of looking at individual position descriptions. I have seen some phenomenal position descriptions and KPIs that quite literally cannot fit within an 8-hour workday. So how do we achieve this ridiculous expectation of KPIs if there's quite literally not enough time to achieve it? So it goes home with employees. And then constantly review your control measures just to make sure that they are working as planned. There's something to be said for training managers on how to support employee wellbeing. It really has to start from the top, which we briefly touched on in the webinar.
I would just add to that WorkSafe released absolutely sensational guideline how to be compliant with this law. And one of the first things that they will say is you should be surveying your staff in relation to identifying the hazards in the first place. Yep. And that's your starting point.
Yep.
And once you've surveyed, then you start to look at what we need to do across the workplace. But I would refer everybody to the Safe Work site and the tools that they have provided to people, because they've really done a great job.
Feels like with a lot of the regulations and keeping people safe, that two-way communication is really important. You said it on a few podcasts ago, the tone from the top sets the tone at the bottom.
It's the tone at the top, sets the mood in the middle, which creates the buzz at the bottom.
I like that. I'm going to quickly write that down. We'll write that down.
Yeah, it sounds cheesy, but I think it feels like just having that open dialogue
true, though. Absolutely.
is really important
absolutely.
across the board.
And I guess just to add to that, there's such an important role that HR has to play in this. So again, I'm just going to go back to, I guess, what I saw in practice is that I've seen some truly amazing policies and procedures, beautifully laid out, compliant with the law, contextualised or customised for the workplace, amazing documents. This is the stuff I enjoy reading. But they've never seen the light of day. They've only ever been in the HR manager's top drawer. Employees aren't aware of their rights, their responsibilities, their obligations. And then you find a matter before the Fair Work Act and you wonder why the unfair dismissal was upheld, because the employee was dismissed but they had no idea of what they were supposed to comply with.
Yeah.
So it's really important to ensure that your policies, your procedures, your employment contracts, that they remain current, but your staff are aware of their existence and they haven't just read them, they've understood them, because there's some language in there that is sometimes I have to Google a word and think, well, that's a new one. I haven't seen that one before. So it has to be written in such a way that staff understand these documents. So again, back to education.
Another top concern from the webinar, from our data, says the Privacy Act, changes to the Privacy Act. Really brief, top level, what's happened there?
So many things. Where do we start? Well, we have now increased civil penalties for breaches to the Privacy Act. We've got the introduction of the doxing offences, which introduces criminal penalties.
I mean, I think one of the things that Jaylene's just mentioned is the creation of a tort because of privacy breaches, which means an individual can actually be sued as a tortious liability under the new legislation. Now that an organisation is not only responsible for its people, but if that person does something in relation to the privacy law that's maybe outside of their work obligations, that individual can now be sued personally. And there are huge personal liabilities, including there's also criminal liability associated with it. So, which means that if an individual goes and breaches others' people's privacy, they can now go to jail. And this has a really interesting intersection with social media.
Yep.
And you see a lot of young people, playing with social media and utilising WhatsApp, Snapchat, chats with photos, information about people, private information about people, and spreading that to other people. That's now, as strongly illegal as you can get. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes it's mind-boggling that these sorts of things still happen and that we have to then regulate it. If it's someone's personal information, there's 6 years imprisonment. If you're targeting someone on the basis of a protected attribute, whether it's on the basis of their sex or their race, well, that's an aggravated offence. So you're looking at the 7 years imprisonment for that, which makes sense though, because we're seeing a lot of this online, and it's not just with adults. We're seeing it, like you just touched on, with kids. Yeah, we're seeing it in school. I've seen it with in primary school even. As soon as someone gets a device, it's phenomenal.
And if you go back to the principles we spoke about before, is it honest? Is it ethical? Is it harmful? You go back to that all the time. That's why people say, where do I start with compliance?
Start with kindness.
I go, start with general human Christian tenets, right? Instill into your workplace. Don't harm, treat others as you would have them treat you. If they sit at the crux of your standards as an organisation, and from the minute someone walks into your organisation, that's what you preach. And every time you go, if you're not sure about whether something's to do the right thing, ask yourself, does it feel right? Is it ethical? Is it honest? Is it harmful? If you say no to one of those things, then you're probably breaching some law. Yeah. So come and report it to your manager.
That's a great way to summarise it.
So
culture
culture.
Says it really is.
That's right. So if an organisation comes to me and says, where do I start? I say start here, because it's a great place to start. And from there, you start off with a code of conduct and you teach those things, and then you build out how you approach various different laws from there. Starting this journey is a really difficult one. And when we've just told you've got to be compliant with 400 pieces of legislation, which one should you start with? So I would say there are 20 core pieces of legislation that apply to all organisations. and it doesn't matter what you do or who you are, you've got to have to be compliant with these laws.
Yeah.
That's the right place to start.
Yep.
And if you start there, you're at least doing a whole lot of things right.
Another big change FY25 that we've spoken about at length, it feels like, respect at work and the positive duty. It's been a really big one. And I think that's affected not just almost every business, but not just business as well, everyone.
Yeah, it was huge. We saw really fundamental changes in relation to that legislation where, of course, it's not just enough that sexual harassment's illegal. Organisations have a positive duty to prevent sexual harassment from occurring. So that was a really big shift that went through last year. I think we've started to see those laws enshrined as pretty standard core compliance. We're an interesting litmus of the business world and what they're doing. And we've still got a lot of organisations coming to us saying we need respect at work training. But there's now really no pushback to taking the bundle of respect at work courses, which is sort of the positive duty. Yep. What are the other courses in it? Gosh, I'm having a mental blank.
So many. Harassment, bullying,
harassment,
discrimination.
Diversity and inclusion, discrimination are all sort of part of that bundle. You can't do one without the other. You have to do them all. There's interplay between all of them. And organisations are really getting that now, which is for us to see that. I think there's been a shift and a movement in understanding of how important these laws are. And the change that needs to be made in organisations culturally. So I think we're starting to see a real culture shift in organisations really starting to move into the realm of proactive compliance.
Yeah, just to recap for anyone that doesn't know, I assume most listeners probably do know, positive duty means that a business needs to demonstrate that they are actively trying to make sure sexual discrimination doesn't happen rather than retroactively doing something about
and
it. And
it's reasonable and proportionate measures as far as practicable, to then eliminate the discrimination or the harassment. And so I guess if we go back to the why, unfortunately, sexual harassment is still prevalent in our workforce. And I saw that firsthand in private practice. To be honest with you, I was actually really quite surprised at how prevalent it was. So there were so many clients, so many matters that would come to us with fairly substantial evidence, and we could see it was absolutely happening. But then the steps to go through to actually reach a positive outcome, there's a breakdown in the relationship with the employer, and obviously then there's a disconnect. It was actually really quite surprising for me to see it in that way. This push for a proactive approach ensures that the employer is doing everything possible and not just responding after the fact. Because once something's happened, some of these matters, this changes people's lives and you take it with you for life. It's not something you can just leave at work and sleep on it and you're over it the next day. Some of these cases are quite horrific. Really important that workplaces are listening to their employees. Don't just sweep it under the rug. Actually listen to what your employees are saying and take some measures to investigate and eliminate.
About it before, I think being proactive also allows there to be a culture shift where I think your peers are also paying attention to what is right, what isn't right, and calling you out before it even happens, even if you don't realise.
The bystander.
Completely.
Well, there are rules around that too as well. So the Australian Human Rights Commission has released 7 key standards from memory. And so it's really important, I think, that if businesses don't have any understanding in this space and they're ready to turn their minds to it, have a look at that website. And there's lots of resources.
Fantastic website also.
Lots of resources on there.
Interestingly, the prevalence of sexual harassment is that it's large, but it's also significantly underreported.
Absolutely.
So there are massive amounts of underreporting in relation to sexual harassment. It is a huge issue.
Fear and
the number one issue. Oh,
exactly.
I'll test you. Okay?
Oh, okay, right. Great. No. And we will.
Number one is fear of retaliation.
Fear of retaliation.
So people think they're going to lose their job.
Yep.
Concern that the harasser holds more power than them.
Loss of job.
Yep. Distrust in the system.
Yep, absolutely.
Emotional barriers.
Oh, can we unpack that further?
Shame,
yes.
Shame, embarrassment, or self-blame.
Okay.
I wore a
blame the
short skirt
victim.
because
like
I'm embarrassed to say this happened. I don't want to admit this happened. Similar to rape.
Is that in line with fear that no one will believe you?
Yep. Trauma response. So feeling frozen or overwhelmed, and fear of being judged or not believed. Lack of knowledge or support.
Sometimes, yes.
Not
on
knowing
that,
the process.
From what I saw is that sometimes the employee wasn't aware that they were actually harassed. So then when they would come into the office and talk through the scenario, well, that would be our response saying, well, you actually experienced harassment. And they had no idea that
They
that's
didn't
actually,
realise.
that's actually what happens.
Wow.
Because they also didn't know what their rights were in the workplace, because there is this natural power imbalance between employer and employee. And so there's going to be a disconnect with what's right and what's wrong, but you'd hope that the lines weren't that blurred that we're not sure what's harassment and what's not.
Well, on to one of the main points, which is actually minimisation or normalisation.
Absolutely.
Normalising, the behaviour and thinking that it's okay.
Yes.
We actually offer clients a survey where we survey their workplace prior to rolling out training so that and it's quite a detailed survey, but it goes in and says, have you either witnessed, experienced or seen these type of behaviours? And it goes right through explicit sexual harassment to jokes, other types of things that might be sexual harassment. It also asks about leadership and a whole lot of stuff. It's an excellent survey. It's a really great place to benchmark where your organisation's at, because you sort of get a report that says, this is where we're at. We can customise the training to match what the items were that were found in this report. So then you focus on those areas for the training, train your staff, and then you run the benchmark report again in 6 months' time. And hopefully you can show that you've actually fixed or you've reduced some of those risks in your business.
And hopefully that trend of improvement.
Absolutely. And that's what the AHRC want to see you doing. Yep. So that's one of the positive steps that you can be doing. But what is interesting is, of a number of the survey results that I've seen, the commonality across all businesses has been jokes, innuendos. Nobody knows that's sexual harassment. So
explicit posters on the wall, which
more people know about that. It's more about sort of little sexist jokes that goes on to undermine and goes ongoing and going. No one actually understands that sexual harassment now. That is now part of the sexual harassment laws. So no one's going to report that if they don't know it. No. Right? How do we fix that? Correct. We train our staff.
And I think just on that's a good point, because sometimes when we step back and we look at the intention. So the intention might not have been to actually sexually harass. It might have just been a passing joke that they've said their whole lives, and there's this perception, well, that's okay, it was just a joke. But again, through education, we might need to shift some views, because how it's perceived by the other party is perhaps not how it was intended. I have seen a few of these reports, also external to Safetrac, and I just remember reading one where there was a question in there that said, inappropriate sexual contact, do you believe this is sexual harassment, yes or no? And there was still somewhere around 5% of employees said no. So
the clue's in the name, inappropriate, surely?
Exactly right. So sometimes I think what we assume is common sense is not actually common, or maybe 5% were playing a joke. But if that's the report the organisation is running to see where their employees are at now, to then do a gap analysis to where we want to get them to ensure that we're compliant, well, that's probably a starting point.
Yeah. Shocking, if anything. If it wasn't a joke, 5% of people don't understand that inappropriate sexual contact is sexual harassment.
I mean, I'd almost hope, and I hope no one does this really, but I almost hope that someone was just going tick, 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 because they didn't want to do the survey, as opposed to actually thinking.
That's true, and that could be true.
No. Yeah. So maybe let's make an assumption that was the case.
There is, though. I feel, though, like society has moved very, very quickly.
I think so.
And changed very dramatically. I'd say from the Me Too movement, which sort of happened during COVID, we've seen a massive change in culture, in expectations, in women's rights. I think that Me Too movement's been a pretty pivotal moment for businesses and compliance as well, and the impact it's had on that. And so it's very interesting that we've got different generations of people that work in our workplaces, and their sense of what's funny and what's acceptable really differs between generations. I mean, when I was growing up, my parents watched, I'm not going to say that, they actually didn't watch. It was on the TV. They didn't like to watch it, but it would come on from time to time. And they would straight away turn it off. And it was a no, don't watch this show. But it was the funniest show on TV. And that was, oh my God, what's his name? The English guy, Benny Hill.
Oh, can't put that on TV.
Can't put that on TV anymore. When I was growing up, we used to watch a show called The Goodies,
Yeah.
which was an English comedy series. I watched one of those episodes the other day and I was horrified.
Yeah.
That came out 10, 15 years ago that I rewatch, and I'm like, oh, this would not pass the test today.
So we have changed our standards really quickly. And a lot of the time, people who may be offending some of these laws, I think to your points, they're just not aware and they didn't mean offence. And this is where education and training becomes just so critical,
And
that you get in front of them.
Well, it's keeping pace with the change.
Absolutely.
And this is what we do 5 days a week. And for some of us, we do it on weekends because we love it. I'm constantly reading the legislation, reading the case law, because that's always been a passion of mine. Not everyone has that particular passion, and not everyone has the time or capacity to unpacking the legislation, unpacking the regulations, and trying to keep pace. So that's why we do that, to ensure that there's enough educational resources out there to correct a lot of these issues in the workplace, because the risk of getting it wrong really isn't just a financial risk. Like, this is people's lives. This is people who need to go home to their families and don't want to go home after being sexually harassed and don't want to experience a workplace fatality. The actual ripple effect is massive, and it doesn't just stop in the workplace.
Little things as well, doesn't it? If you let little things pass,
Yep.
and if you're watching your mates make some sort of banter joke and, oh, it's all right, they didn't mean it, then further down the track, you let that little thing slip 2 or 3 years later, hey presto.
And how does the saying go? The behaviour you
The behaviour
ignore is the behaviour you accept, or
Yeah.
something to that.
Yeah.
It's
Something like
exactly
that.
right,
Behaviour
though.
you accept.
Yeah.
It's an interesting place at Safetrac. Whenever everybody says anything that's not okay, the whole place goes, no, not okay.
Yeah.
There's a real pushback because there is community knowledge that's now being shared. People will go, ooh, that's the line. And I think when your line's spoken about and you go, that's the line, you've gone past it and everyone acknowledges that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go past the line.
So if someone
That's
genuinely
it.
made a mistake, oh, I'm really sorry, I didn't realise.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah, and accept the apology. I've sometimes seen people make mistakes and the apology wasn't accepted. There were good intentions, and then there's this breakdown in the relationship. It kind of goes on both
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think
both
that's
sides.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very important.
So looking ahead to FY26, what could be coming on the horizon? I think the top headlines that we were looking or talking about, right to disconnect. There's a lot happening,
Well, that's already happened.
right?
Yeah,
Right.
so
There are expansions that we're...
well, in the employment law space, there's been a lot of changes to the Fair Work Act with the closing loopholes legislation. So there's a phased rollout. So our larger organisations, our medium to larger organisations had to, the right to disconnect, casual conversion came into effect last year. So they're allowing a 12-month grace period for smaller organisations. And that probably goes towards what we were talking about before about smaller businesses might feel that they're disproportionately disadvantaged, but that's one example where they've got a 12-month grace period to then comply. But yeah, lots of changes.
And a big one that we're speaking about a lot at the moment, AML and CTF.
Yes.
What AML, anti-money laundering, CTF, counter-terrorism financing?
Yes, nailed it.
Well, effectively, the AML and CTF laws have now been extended to apply to a whole lot more types of organisations. So you're talking real estate agencies, law firms, jewellers, dealers. So people who see large transactions of money pass through them are now being caught up in the AML CTF legislation. So what that means is they need to ensure now that their businesses are compliant with it. Now, previously it was sort of in the realm of the banks, the finance institutions. So the figure was that there's over $12.8 billion worth of potential laundered money going through our real estate agencies.
Which is incredible.
Which is just an
huge.
enormous amount of money.
Yeah.
Australia's quite behind in extending this legislation across to a broader range of categories of businesses. There's some global standards that we were falling foul of, and had we continued to not extend it to those, there would have been some significant penalties for us that would have been financially quite damaging for Australia. So it was something that had to happen, but those businesses have sort of been given an extended timeline of when they need to be compliant by. The legislation is actually in place now, but they've got various things they need to be doing by certain dates over the next 12 months.
So for our accountant friends as well, that's even your small accounting firms. There's a lot to unpack there. Regulated by Austrac. These new entities have to register by March next year, I believe. And then they have to be ready to fully comply by July next year. Really want to jump onto understanding the requirements and planning towards it now.
What does compliance look like?
A compliance would start with developing an AML CTF program, and within the program there needs to be the appointment of a compliance officer. There needs to be the establishment of a reporting group. There's mandatory reporting of suspicious matters. The risk assessments have to be tailored to the business's size, to the services that they provide. So the services for a solicitor would probably be different to an accountant, different to a real estate professional. And then also tailored to the client base, looking at your client base to assess risk. There's customer due diligence reports as well. It's a whole framework.
There's a lot of stuff that went very far over my head.
But coming back to training, there needs to be role-specific training.
So this was the big one that I took out of the AML, because I noticed the role-specific training seemed quite a big shift. I've seen it mentioned in a couple of other regulations, but this one specifically is quite important, isn't it?
To expand on that, because different roles have different risks, and they need to be aware of the risks in their space. So in the AML space, you've got frontline staff, and they're probably best placed to recognise suspicious behaviour or a suspicious matter at a transactional level. Whereas then you've got your compliance team that are submitting all the reports, so they have to understand the reporting thresholds, all the reporting obligations. So not everyone has to be across everything, but if you look towards role-specific training, well, first you have to understand the regulations. What are the requirements in the regulations, which is, what we do. We love this stuff. Look towards implementing the training at that role level. Yeah.
Really interesting. And I think this is going to be really important for quite a much larger number of industries than previously they thought, because it was just finance before, wasn't it?
Financial services sector.
Up to a huge number of industries. Is this going to go further?
Oh, look, I don't often see regulations stop at a certain point and say, I think we've regulated enough. That's enough red tape. Usually it's, okay, so this is rolled out. Everyone's a little disgruntled at first, but then there comes this point in time where everyone's accepted it, and then we'll just push the standards a little bit further and just tighten the noose a little bit, to be honest. No, I think that usually they will trial and test it with either a certain size business or a particular industry at risk, but then phase it out. But that's just speculation from what I've seen.
None of this is legal advice.
On that?
FYI,
no, just an opinion on that one.
The last subject I think that was a really interesting one, and I think everyone will find very interesting, is AI. There's no specific regulation at the moment, is there? Okay. Yeah.
Technology moves so fast.
Yes.
The law doesn't. So in this respect, so you've got technology at super speeds, and usually it isn't until there's been some consequence or a breach, health and safety risks, or whatever it might be, privacy breaches, for example, then the law has to keep up.
And I think it's something, literally the world is speaking about AI at the moment. We're seeing content we don't quite trust. You're wondering where the line is, how we integrate tools. There's privacy issues there. So I think everyone's feeling like there probably needs to be some tightening of regulation.
I think it's a matter of who's making decisions about AI is one of the big problems.
Right.
I know one of the big ethical problems that has come up a number of times is a self-driven car makes decisions and who's, for instance, if it's got the option of driving into a traffic light and hitting the driver, or going through some traffic and hitting some passengers, which way should the car stumble? Well, at the moment, that decision's being made by a programmer. And who gave that person the right to make that decision?
I remember Ethics 101, and we as a people couldn't even agree in the lecture hall.
Correct.
You had half on one side saying it should be A and half on the other side saying B. So who determines whether it's A or B?
That's right. That's absolutely right. And that's actually why in Australia we're not having self-driven cars. So we haven't necessarily agreed with the framework for the decision-making that's happened. Apparently they've been coded to do the least harm, but they're still making a judgment call.
We're still getting harmed. So, whose fault? Not necessarily fault, but who takes the blame? Is blame the wrong word? Blame's probably the right word.
Who suffers the harm?
Who suffers the harm? Yeah.
That's the good example that I use in AI in terms of people getting on board with going, I understand, yes, okay, so should there be laws around this? We're asking it to make decisions for us, how much it comes into our life and how it's going to affect our lives. And yet it's growing unextended and untethered and unregulated out there right now. It's as to where it goes to from here. There's Tesla's making robots at the moment. Putedly will be available at $20,000 each, which to me seems just so cheap. Yeah. At $20,000, I want a robot in my home cooking my dinner too. And then we're going to have these robots automatically come in and take over a whole lot of roles. Hospitals, for example, they say the first place they'll be. Hospitals and nursing homes. They can lift people. They're not harmed. There's no psychosocial health in an AI being. And this is a really interesting point, I think, for compliance, because all of a sudden we've got the opportunity to create a workforce of workers, of people who don't have health and safety risks.
Can AI suffer psychosocial health?
Well, at this point, I'd say no.
Well, probably at some.
There was a big article in the paper last night about 15-year-olds will no longer be able to get jobs because all their jobs are getting taken over by AI, because all the drive-thrus in all the fast food restaurants all being replaced by AI. So it's going to wipe a whole workforce out, which is their first job, right? The article was saying there's going to be so much pushback from people will stop going to their restaurants because it's taking their jobs away from people. And I'm like, no, it won't. Yeah, it won't. It's just not going to.
I think things happen slightly more slowly than that. A lot of the times we don't notice the change.
Both Pizza Hut and I think KFC are rolling out AI drive-through things straight away. I think McDonald's is already sort of half.
I was a little upset when there were self-serve checkouts at Woolworths. I like interacting with a human.
Great example, because they've been in place for a number of years
and hasn't
yet we haven't had a reduction in our jobs.
Yeah.
So it's
you're welcome.
Yeah.
We've come full circle.
That's it. So is it but what's the ethical and what's the legal space in and around it?
Yeah, it's really scary to unpack when there's a role that requires moral judgment, ethical perspective. I mean, that's right. I mean, not that we all necessarily agree one particular path is the right path, but it still requires a human component, human compassion, human connection. And I'd be interested to see how you can just bypass that human connection.
I'm a huge proponent of AI.
Are you?
And, I would encourage my staff to come to me with how we're AIing our business. And it's funny because I've had staff come to me say, I'm literally worried about my job. I'm worried about if AI my department, there won't be a job for me. And I'm like, of course there'll be a job for you because someone's got to run it. Someone's got to make it. Someone's got to verify. Someone's got to be there to make sure it's working. But we can do things faster, better.
Yeah, it's efficiency, fairness, etc.
But, at the same time, it needs to be lawful.
Absolutely.
So anyway, in answer to the question, they have put together a task force group to examine this area and come up with some recommendations for some legislation. There is talk of it being rolled out by the end of this year.
Probably needs to.
Yeah. Really, it probably should have happened 3 years ago. Yeah. But you've got to see change occur
well,
to then know what
sometimes
you've got
change
to address.
Just seems to, look at
so fast.
The one that did my head in is vaping. Vapes were legal. They've got a whole generation of kids now addicted to vapes.
Yeah.
I'm like, why didn't you legislate 10 years ago? Seriously, it blows my mind.
Oh, well, some things, are reasonably foreseeable and some things aren't. I think we saw this one coming.
I think so too.
I'm pretty sure in Back to the Future videos, they saw things coming.
Yeah. Jaylene, really appreciate you being here. I think we'll probably do a few more with you guest spotting because it's been really good to unpack your experience. I think you've got a lot of relevant experience for us to talk about and that our audience are going to care about as well. So
thank you.
Thank you for coming along and we'll see you next time. Thanks everyone.